Welcome everyone to our 43rd web debate on diplomacy. As you know, once a month we meet to debate in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training to kind of take a closer look on current and emerging issues in diplomatic practice. And today we meet to take a closer look at the Internet Governance Forum and its multi-stakeholder architecture. This, of course, couldn't be more timely, as this year's IGF is just getting underway. My name is Katharina Höhne. I'm the Director of Research at DiploFoundation, and I have the pleasure to moderate this debate. The first Internet Governance Forum took place in 2006. It is still an absolutely unique forum in that it follows a multi-stakeholder approach and it provides a one-stop shop for digital policy debates. Some would say that if the IGF would not exist, it would surely have to be invented. Yet, debates about IGF reform intertwined with debates about the goals and purpose of the IGF are almost as old as the forum itself. These are debates about inclusivity, about coordination and cooperation, about concrete outcomes, about financing, and the relationship to the UN system, to name just a few points. Last year in June, the high-level panel on digital cooperation, which was mandated by the UN Secretary General, launched its report. And as part of this report, and as part of addressing digital cooperation, there are a few suggestions on the future of the IGF architecture. In particular, there are 3 suggestions. And one of these suggestions is the so-called IGF Plus proposal. And at this point, the IGF Plus seems to be one of the favored options for IGF reform and for the future of internet governance. Then this year, we had the UN Secretary General launch its roadmap on digital cooperation, again, making a number of suggestions for IGF reform. As you can see from this very, very brief introduction, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm glad I'm not doing this alone, but with the help of an impressive lineup of speakers. So let me briefly introduce them. We have with us today Dr. Andrea Calderaro, who is Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Cardiff University. We have Dr. Olga Cavalli, ISOC Board of Trustees member and co-founder and academic director of the South School on Internet Governance. We have Dr. William Drake, International Fellow and Lecturer at the Department of Communication and Media Research at the University of Zurich. And last but not least, Dr. Matthias Kettemann, a senior researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Media Research, the Hans Bredow Institute. But before I turn to our speakers for their comments and insights, let me remind you that we are trying to make this debate as interactive as possible. This means we're looking for your comments and questions. You can post them either here in Zoom in the chat or in the chats on Facebook and YouTube if you're following us there. We will collect all these comments and questions and we'll bring them into the debate. Today, I will do this with the help of my colleague, Katarina Angelkovic. Speaking of interactivity, before we hear from our speakers, I would like to hear from you. We have prepared a short poll, which one of my colleagues will now bring up. And here we want to ask you, what is the most important area of IGF reform? There are 6 possible answers, so to speak, that you can tick. These are taken from the roadmap of the UN Secretary General. For those who are familiar with that, you will recognize them. But for the others, also have a think and kind of pick one of these options. So for those listening, the 6 options regarding IGF reform are: first, having a more focused agenda. Second, establishing a high-level segment and ministerial or parliamentarian tracks. Third, forging stronger links with regional, national, sub-regional and youth initiatives. A fourth option for reform, better integrating program and intersessional policy development work. Fifth, addressing IGF's long-term sustainability, in particular in terms of financing and fundraising. And sixth, enhancing IGF visibility in terms of corporate identity, improved reporting, and similar proposals. I know this is not an easy choice, and these things go together, but please choose one of these options and submit now. And we're almost ready to close the poll. Let me just give you a couple more seconds. And we will bring back the poll results later in the discussion. So let me thank you for casting your vote, and we will have a closer look at the results later on and ask our speakers what they think about the question and the results from our audience. But without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker. And here I would like to start with a general question. When we look at the high-level panel on digital cooperation, when we look at the Secretary General's roadmap, what do we see? What are hopeful signs? And also, at the same time, what are areas of concern for the future of IGF? And here I would like to turn to Bill to kind of start us off with his impressions and his insights on this very broad question. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, and hello everybody. Great to see you. Timing, as Katharina noticed or suggested, is very good since the IGF is going now. In 4 to 5 minutes, I will make just a couple of comments about. I was asked about hopeful signs and areas of concern. So 3 quickly on each front, and won't have the ability to go into them in any detail, but hopefully we can come back to them more later on. Starting with the hopeful signs, I think, first of all, at a process level, the fact that we have this high-level engagement from the UN Secretary General, indeed from certain governments, particularly in Europe, is a good sign. This leads to a more institutionalized kind of dialogue that doesn't drop the ball and just kind of wander off. It's led to there being new circles of engagement in IGF discussions, adding on to the groups of people who have been involved since before the beginning, going back to 2004. And that's led to some evolution in thinking and refinement of ideas. That's good. Of course, at the same time, we have to guard against any excessive UN-ification. We don't want the IGF to be turned into a sort of top-down process where deals are cut off stage, et cetera, et cetera. We have to ensure that the open bottom-up aspect is preserved. A second hopeful thing I would say is that there are some useful things in the Secretary General's roadmap. The high-level body, multi-stakeholder high-level body could be useful if it's not a separate power center of disengaged potentates and is not exclusionary with regard to possible participants. The suggestion of a more focused agenda and a high-level segment or a ministerial parliamentarian track. These are all good things. Thirdly, I'm hopeful somewhat on the notion of outcomes, improved outcomes. Henriette Esterhuizen, the chair of the MAG, has been organizing online workshops, and I chaired one recently on the question of outcomes. It was noted by a number of people that the IGF already does have outcomes in a sort of decentralized way, but there's a need to aggregate the information about what people are doing under the IGF umbrella and present it in a more coherent manner that governments and other stakeholders can appreciate. But obviously beyond that, there's a desire on the part of many parties for something firmer. And for a long time, only civil society seemed to want that. But now it seems that thinking is evolving and people are becoming more open to the idea of some kind of more defined outcomes, collective expressions of shared perspective. The question is in what form and so on. Many people are still very unhappy with the idea of recommendations, even though it's in the IGF mandate. It sounds like a negotiated thing to them. I've suggested the idea of options for action, which can be pre-prepared through a preparatory process and refined in a couple of sessions, 2 one-day sessions, and endorsed by those groups that wish to align themselves with it, and with minority positions being published alongside the options, et cetera. This might be something that could be done. Of course, you would need a real preparatory process with RFCs and so on to do it. But I think it's somewhat helpful that people are at least open to talking about this now. Areas of concern, the circles of engagement that have developed are not wide enough, which raises questions about the outputs of this process and the viability of reforms that are predicated on the notion that you're going to have all these people engaged in doing stuff. The high-level panels original model calling for creating these new bodies, I think it was pretty sketchy and not fully thought through, and it's been very difficult to get details about how they would actually work and how you would actually populate them. Having standing bodies that are just standing around is not so useful. So we have to figure out how, if we're going to try to build something more substantial, to really get more fulsome engagement from everybody. But it can be done. The Net Mondial did it on the fly in a one-off event, so it's possible. Secondly, we need to overcome some of the sort of a priori instinctive reactions to the notion of firmer, clearer outcomes. And I think there are ways of structuring a debate around that, which we can come back to later. And then finally, I think one of the areas of concern is the difficulty of building a winning coalition of champions for change here. Right now we've got clear expressions of support for it in certain European governments and smattering of other actors, et cetera. We need something broader than that, obviously. What happens in the US could matter to some extent in this context. On the other hand, if the US situation goes the wrong way, then what happens in the IGF will be the least of our concerns. But hopefully we can build a coalition of interest around making something work here. So that's my 5 minutes, and I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. There's a lot to unpack here. Just maybe to name two things that really kind of stuck out for me is the question of the relationship to the UN, the question of having champions for change who can drive the process, but also again this question of what shape do clear outcomes actually take, and what do we mean by that? With that in mind, let me turn to our next speaker, Olga. And here the question is, how do you see this whole process in particular from the Latin American perspective? And how do you assess the current reform proposals and perhaps also what Bill already put on the table? Any thoughts and perspectives from you, Olga?
Thank you, Catalina. Thank you for the invitation, and so good to see many friends, at least from the distance in this virtual life. I miss you all, guys and ladies. I miss traveling. I cannot believe I say this, but I do miss traveling, and I do miss meeting with you here and there. So thank you for the question. So I was thinking about what we were thinking about last year in the IGF in Berlin, and at that time, our main concern in the region was that the Latin America economy had grown slower than any other developing region. So that was last year, and at that time, without a change in productivity, the GDP of the region would be 40% less than other regions. Guess what? The COVID came. So now the situation is much, much worse. So now, as some information provided by the Economic Commission of the United Nations, ICLAC, the GDP of all the region will diminish by more than 9%. So the economic situation is really complex. Unemployment rises 5% more. So this means we will have 18 million new unemployed people that will make 45 million unemployed people in the region, 23 million poor people, and some more in extreme poverty, and many, perhaps more than 2 million small and medium enterprises in real danger of existing in the future. So technology and digital economy and the improvement of digitalization and infrastructure becomes extremely relevant. But what COVID showed in this 6 or 5 months of working at home is that many companies quickly catch the new style of working at home. In my university, we're providing all the classes virtually, but it showed a big gap in between those that we are connected and those small and medium enterprises, companies, and people who are not connected. Also, it showed a kind of worrying thing for poor families, where the cost of connecting to the internet is about 14 or 12% of the whole family income. And for richer families, it's about much less. So what is recommended by the Broadband Commission of the United Nations is 2%. So what I find in the digitalization in developing economies is fundamental catch up. So last year it was bad, now it's much, much worse. And the possibilities of recovering are still uncertain. We don't know what will happen in the next month, so maybe the economies still are in a slower pace, and those companies that are in problem now will be in much problem in the next month. So looking at the different models, the big challenge that we have seen for developing economies is how to engage constructively in this dialogue. I love the IGF. I was in all the IGFs, now virtually participating. I was in the day that the IGF was created in Tunis, and I think it's a great space. I think we have achieved a lot with the IGF, but still developing economies need to catch the momentum and be more involved and profit from the discussions there. So in these new models that were included in the report from the United Nations high-level panel, I see a lot of value in having local networks that can interact with other experts at the higher level. I think Bill explained that very well. I think we need more focus, but the highest challenge for developing economies is that you have to overcome the urgency. There is always something urgent in a developing country that you have to attend. So paying attention to what is being discussed in the IGF always becomes something like, oh, really? I don't have time for that. I have a strike. I have people with hunger. I have SMEs that are closing because of the economy. How can I focus on thinking about policies that may enhance that? But that's the key. The key is to plan, to manage the future, and to think strategically how to incorporate technology into the developing economy. So that is a very challenging issue. So I think that focusing more on regional meetings, involving the key persons that are developing the regulations at the national and regional level into the global discussion is very important, because they can bring ideas, and they can learn from other countries, they can learn from colleagues. And I think that we're missing some of this person-to-person interaction that we had in the corridors and in the cafes, but we still can have that in a virtual mode. So between the three models, I like better the IGF Plus, but I think that the co-governance architecture brings some interesting things, like, for example, digital cooperation networks that could focus on regional problems and national challenges that could benefit from learning from other regions. So I will stop here and see how the dialogue evolves.
Thank you so much. And I think this was a great reminder regarding inclusivity for the IGF and regarding regional concerns from developing countries. I think that's an extremely important addition to this debate, and surely to future debates we're having in this area. Kind of let me make a quick switch and kind of look at the process of arriving at proposals for IGF reform and how this very process can be constructed in a useful way. And here I turn to Matthias. And Matthias, from what I understand, is that there was a global stakeholder consultation process leading up to the roadmap, and in particular to recommendation 5 on digital cooperation. And I understand you were part of that process. And so looking at that, what kind of lessons learned can you share? And what is, how do we legitimize these kind of processes, collecting suggestions for reform and working towards reform?
Thank you so much for having me, Katharina. Thanks to the excellent speakers from before. I also would have so much wanted to meet you again, like last year in Berlin, where we were very welcome to host international internet governance community. Now, after the publication of the UN Secretariat General's roadmap, which included a number of recommendations, one big question came to the mind, not only of me, but of many governments across the world. How can we develop recommendations as to the future of the internet cooperation architecture without asking the world's population about it, without asking the people. Is it really enough that only experts debate those issues? You know, only the, 900 plus people who wake up every morning and think about how can we make a better IGF? Of course, it's in any international policy arena, but especially in the internet, which I would submit touches our daily lives much more than perhaps the Antarctica regime. In those areas, it is extremely important to legitimize policy developments, right? And in a challenging field like the internet, where the whole world is a stakeholder, governments had to find a way to develop workable deliberative democracy approaches. So approaches to getting people on board, getting opinions on board, right? Sorry, Bill, didn't want to diss Antarctica. You're perfectly right. It's an important part of the world. However, so the German and the United Arab Emirates government were given the task to develop further ideas regarding recommendation 5A and B, which relate to the future digital cooperation architecture, the IGF plus model being one of those models discussed. And what they did was something which I still find very interesting, namely they engaged the services of different international civil society organizations, including Mission Publique and the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. And both of them held regional consultations in cooperation with organizations such as UN ECLAC and the African Union, but also on a local level with stakeholder representatives from national internet communities. And they discussed with them, based on an abbreviated version of the recommendation by the UN Secretary General, and discussed sort of the pros and cons of the different models. And I was involved, as you've so graciously said, in both of those initiatives, and I found it so interesting and enlightening to see, what 200, 300 more or less representative people thought about those models, whether it is actually possible within a period of half a day to think about the finer points of the differences between an IGF plus model and a digital commons model with people who haven't talked about those things, haven't thought about those things every day for the last 5 years. Because that's one of the, we're all a bit of in an iron cage of internet governance, right? I know what the, what IGF plus means, but how do you explain that to somebody who perhaps who doesn't have the privilege of thinking of Bill and his writings every day? So after those events, both organizations submitted reports, and together with submissions of about 20 other stakeholders, including states, but also including international organizations, the German and UAE government then together submitted the findings in an option paper. And I think that this is really something which we can look at as a good example for future internet policy development. How to get the people back not only online, but how to get them back into online related diplomacy work. And a lot of some people who I see today here were also involved in those initiatives. So I'm happy to hear your comments on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, for these comments. And again, a good reminder on inclusivity and how we can design inclusivity. I think this is really important also for our debate that follows your intervention. So this is something we surely can pick up on. And there's also already a really interesting discussion going on in the chat. So I really appreciate it, seeing your comments and questions. Keep them coming. We're just about to bring them into the discussion. But before that, we want to hear from one more speaker, Andrea. And here I have a very, very broad question to kind of lead us off into the discussion, which is, in an ideal world, what would the future of internet governance look like from your perspective? I know it's a broad question, but I'm really curious to see how you tackle it. So over to you, Andrea.
Oh, super. Thank you, Catherine, for asking the $1,000,000 question to me. And I do have, of course, I mean, I do have a million different aspirations for the future developments of the governance of the internet. The main challenge is what is the more plausible aspiration and the hope that we might have for the future developments. I mean, this is a question that most of contributors and attenders to this session ask themselves over the last 20 years. I mean, that's our job and our everyday. And we ask this question ourselves as well at the World Summit on Information Society. So I'm curious, actually, since you're asking whether the answer that I had 20 years ago, whether the aspiration that I had 20 years ago has changed since then. And actually, I would say no. I mean, back 20 years ago, we were already talking about about identifying the more effective transnational governance approach to the internet, inclusive, how we could have ensured that emerging connected countries were going to offer an active contributions to a broader debate on the governance of the internet. And my impression that we are still asking ourselves the same questions, and probably we didn't find the solutions yet. So actually, this is the case also. We compared the documents. I mean, the documents released by the working group on internet governance, and I'm sure Bill has something to say here. And with the digital cooperation document, we surprisingly see that the policy challenges identified by both documents are identical. It was policy challenge was a identification of a governance model for ensuring the security of the internet infrastructure. That was back in the first document, and in 2003, 2005, something that we can now easily discuss about cybersecurity. There was a call for capacity building. There was a call for human rights, ensuring human rights in our experience online. And these again are the policy challenges identified again in the digital cooperation document. So the question then here is, what is of course, what are our aspirations, but what should we do now in order to avoid to ask ourselves the same questions that we asked ourselves 20 years ago, we are asking here today, and avoid to ask the same questions in 20 years from now. So, I mean, we are talking about concepts that are still evolving. Of course, when we talk about capacity building, cybersecurity, technology evolves, and policy challenges around this technology evolves with the technology itself. I can see there is something that probably the lessons learned from over the last 20 years is something that we are witnessing at the moment, especially in the last years, that we did not identify 20 years ago, the World Summit on Information Society, is that the Internet Governance Forum focused over the last 20 years on a specific issue. I mean, we've been discussing for years, for a decade probably, about ICANN, the IANA transition, and we focused our attention there, but at the same time, there were other policy challenges emerging, and the IGF was not able to provide answers to those emerging policy challenges. And I can see that other communities emerged in order to tackle those challenges. I'm talking especially for all the discussions around cybersecurity. We can clearly see that there is a new community discussing cybersecurity challenges, and there is new initiatives and parallel events, parallel boards taking initiatives in this domain. I mean, I'm talking about the UNGG, for example, the UN Group of Governmental Experts, and this is a problem. The fragmentation around the policy, digital policy challenges is a problem that I clearly see here. It's not from a geopolitical perspective. This is, of course, is another dimension of the challenge, but the fragmentation of communities addressing these emerging policy challenges. So back to your question, how are we gonna, this is the lessons learned. This actually is an element that has emerged, it's been mentioned in the digital cooperation report, the problem about the fragmentation of communities. So for the future. The future is, I don't know whether the IGF Plus or other forms that we are able to discuss here today will be able to solve this challenge. For sure, the problem is not even, we should not have the ambition to create a community and to solve this fragmentation, but we clearly need to ensure that there are a regular line of dialogues among these communities in order to be sure to create, to finally find a solution, long-term solution for these emerging digital policy challenges.
Thank you so much. And also thank you really for a good reminder that some of the issues we're debating now have been debated for a very long time, as they are as old as the IGF itself. Yet we are still here with some of the same questions. So the question is, as you said, how do we go forward? Again, a very interesting discussion in the chat, but let me give our speakers an opportunity to comment on each other. You now heard what your fellow speakers, your colleagues said. Is there anything you would like to pick up on, either to kind of underline it or to say, I have a different opinion there? Olga, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for sharing your thoughts. I think that Andrea made an interesting point about this fragmentation of spaces of participation, and for developing countries, those who are responsible for defining regulations, following all the different spaces, sometimes becomes challenging. Not only because of traveling, also because of timing, and so I think that's an issue. But the IGF could be the point where all this information could be joined together as a focus point where all these discussions could be gathered, and that fragmentation could be at least diminished. Sorry, somehow. But that I like Bill's comment about the process of the United Nations Secretary General. I think that was very important, and the quite concrete and quick outcome of the panel. I think that was a very good achievement. That was in a certain time frame, that it produced a report and then the roadmap. So that brought to the whole community a new perspective about the different models that the IGF could have, and brought a lot of thinking about that, not only at the global level, but also in the developing countries. So I think that was good, and I will stop for now. Thank you.
Any other comments, challenges, questions? Yes, Matthias, go ahead.
It's both it's not a question. It's more of a challenge we have to ask ourselves together. You know, I'm researching how norms act on the internet and what they do with us, right? And one thing which I personally find very interesting is the huge difference in procedural and content-related norms. So the debates on the content of, you know, what we have to do online, that's something that's happening among other places at this GGE group, also the Open-Ended Working Group. But I think the procedural dimension is also so important, and this is a thing where a lot of the IGF cooperation reform takes so much importance and value, because I think that the legitimacy which we can create here for future governance arrangements is perhaps even more important than the concrete content of single norms, where a lot of energy is right now being spent. And I think it's lovely that we are focusing here on the procedures of diplomacy, right, of international decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I think it's a really important distinction, and this focus on process is certainly an important one. Yes, Bill, go ahead.
Just further to the point that's been made about fragmentation and the variety of different things going on. I mentioned in the chat that you know, we included in the WIGIG report and in the Tunis agenda this notion that the IGF would be a place to promote and assess on an ongoing basis the extent to which the WSIS principles, inclusivity, et cetera, would be embodied in different IG processes. And we actually pushed for and got once a main session on that, where the idea was supposed to be that these different processes, people from these different processes would come to the table and sort of at least report in to the main session and the community about what was going on there. But what ended up happening, everybody came in and gave kind of stock answers, selling their own activities as being perfect and unimpeachable. And everybody was bored with the session and we never did it again. That's still something that the IGF could be serving a really useful role in, though, is providing the sort of mechanism by which people would be able to at least look into, in an aggregated side-by-side way, what's going on in these different processes and have some means of becoming aware of them and providing an input into them and so on. You're never going to get the WTO people to, open up their process and make it an inclusive, transparent thing. They don't do that. But if you could at least have people who are engaged in that process reporting in and open to being asked questions in some principled manner, that would be highly useful. Same for the security stuff, et cetera. But we've just let that part of the thing drift away. And I feel like that's really missing the opportunity, because particularly for developing country people. Olga was right about how strapped governments are, as well as other stakeholders, in trying to track multiple things in different spaces and not having the institutional capacity. The idea was the IGF would bring these things together in a way where, they would sort of be on the table next to each other and you'd be able to visualize the space more. We're just not doing it. And I really wish we could find a way to reinvigorate that sense of what the IGF was supposed to be about. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Which brings us also to this question: what is it about? Well, what is the goal here? Which is very much intertwined with questions on reform, because we can't answer one question without answering the other, I think. I would like to turn to my colleague Katarina Angelkovic for the tremendous task of summarizing what has been happening in the chat and of bringing into the discussion some of the questions and some of the comments that have been raised there. Katarina, do you want to take this on?
Yes, hello. Hi everyone. I'd like to thank our panelists for all their valuable inputs, and there's also an interesting discussion going on in the chat, making it very hard for me to summarize it in a few sentences. With regard to Bill's initial input, Avri Doria would like to know, in what sense is the IGF not already top-down under control of the UN? And to this end, she asked if IGF Plus returned the IGF to its original multi-stakeholder intent. And then the discussion then unfolded on the bottom-up and top-down structure of the existing IGF. On the other hand, Priyanti commented that connectivity is a major issue for those facing the digital divide in developing economies, and the situation is aggravated as most of the daily paid workers have lost their job due to the lockdown. And to this end, Anriati asked if developing countries are being asked what they really need from evolving digital cooperation. And then, if I may also pose a question in this regard, how to make IGF really responsive to the challenges of developing economies. So that will be all from my end for now. Thank you for all your comments. It was they're very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you for this quick summary. So I picked up on three things: this question of top-down, bottom-up approach, and how that's affected by current reform proposals or by the things we're discussing and we have on the table, the question of UN involvement, questions about connectivity and inclusivity. Anything you would like to pick up on here?
I might, should I try to answer to Ariadne's question. And actually, I'm really curious to hear her comments on that as well. I mean, my impression is that there are, and most of emerging connected countries are demanding for support. They are out there asking, giving their perspectives on the kind of support they need to improve their capacity for the cyber domain. But the point is, it depends on who are these interlocutors in which parts of the government, which part of the society is asking for this support. Because most of governments are asking to support to develop their own cybersecurity capacity. Which is something that might be relevant, of course, but I'm sure that when we go and talk with the civil society, they ask for another kind of support. And this is also when it comes to this challenge that we are witnessing, is about the fragmentation of communities. And so it's not about lacking the interlocutor, but to be sure that there are clear connections, clear line of dialogues between this community. This is my impression and my experience, but of course, Henriette might have some contribution here to offer.
Thank you. Any additional comments? Yeah, Olga.
Thank you.
Because of this
comment
for inclusivity, right?
I think the chat has many very interesting comments, and Henriette was asking if developing economies or governments are being asked. I think that the governments try to participate in different spaces, but people tend to think that governments are monolithic, and they are not. On the contrary, governments are fragmented inside. So there are different ministries, there are different roles that different agencies play. So some are focused on cybersecurity, some other focus on data privacy, others in access. And also there is a gap. I think there is a gap in between the role of the industry and the business sector with the government. I think they should be at the national, regional, and global level more aligned. At the end, most of the companies are the ones improving the infrastructure or managing that data protection or managing information about their customers or users. And I think there's a gap there, especially in developing economies. I think that other regions like Europe have shown that governments can capture the problem, for example, like privacy and security. But as I say, developing economies are always focused on the urgency, and that blend of private, civil society, and governments in bringing ideas together is difficult to achieve. So the IGF could be that point of contact for all these comments. And Andrea made some interesting comments about. Well, I will stop here. So maybe others can comment.
I actually have one follow-up question, because I know you emphasize the need for capacity building. So for governments, people from different ministries to effectively participate in these discussions, and there's a need for capacity building. Is there anything in particular you would emphasize from your experience of someone being very active in this field?
I think that is a challenge for all of us. In order to understand what is happening in relation with digital economy, we all have to become multifunctional professionals. So I'm an engineer, but I have to understand regulations and some laws. I don't have to be a lawyer, but I need to achieve and understand some concepts. And that's the same for lawyers, and that's the same for politicians. And that's extremely challenging because it takes some time. It's not very difficult. It's not rocket science, but you have to take some time and read and hear. So I think that there are many spaces. I think Diplo is the perfect example of trying to bring this blend learning ideas and concepts. So it's the only way, and that's very important for those making policies, for politicians, for presidents, for those making laws. So that's challenging. This is what we try to achieve with the schools of internet governance in different regions and countries, and I think that's good. It's a focus, some days of activities, very broad program, but it brings the concepts that we all should have in mind. And thank you for the question.
Thank you. Any other comments from our speakers to the questions we had on top-down, bottom-up, fragmentation, UN,
small comment, Matthias?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi. So one thing which I think cuts across those categories, namely how to fight against fragmentation of policy fields, how to ensure the involvement of all stakeholders, is improving our knowledge of what input factors national internet policies have. And one way to go about that is one that Germany just used, namely the application of UNESCO's Internet Universality Indicators, which leads to a 150-page report on the state of the Internet. And Germany is not the first country. Brazil did that in 2019. There are now countries in Africa who have done it. I think Nigeria has just completed, Kenya has just completed their assessment. There are a number of assessments ongoing. And I've been leading the German team doing that assessment for Germany. And I can really tell you that our people now know so much more about the internet policy factors and the whole, all the people that you have to talk to be able to develop sensible internet policies, at least within one country, right? And I think that if more countries do that for themselves, this can really contribute to having a better picture, knowing which process to input, knowing which where to kickstart cooperation potential. So we need more data, more knowledge, more cooperation potential.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up question, because you did this very inclusive process of trying to get people's opinion and ideas. If you had to summarize perhaps in one sentence the key lesson learned that you can, as a recommendation for others who want to engage on this kind of process of asking for people's opinion, of trying to be very inclusive in coming up with these proposals. In one sentence, do you have any lesson learned for us?
It's absolutely imperative that you have good preparation materials, that you prepare materials for the people that do the discussion to read, to get a firm grounding without unnecessary complexities. They don't have to know about 50 years of internet development. They have to know about the big issues, and without losing all of the complexity, you still have to try to make it as simple as possible.
Thank you. Let me use this opportunity very quickly to bring in one question from the audience. Mr. Paul Blaker from the UK government. Would you like to come into the discussion? Because we just saw your raised hand, so it would be a pleasure to hear from you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Paul Blaker. I work for the UK government. Thank you very much for putting on this session, and thanks to the panelists for some really interesting input. It's clear there's some really positive ideas being developed now for strengthening the IGF and improving digital cooperation. It's good to be part of that conversation. I wanted to ask a question about an issue which has also been raised in the chat by Henriette and others, and that is the proposal in the Secretary General's roadmap to establish a new high-level body for the IGF. I think a lot of stakeholders were surprised to see that idea appear in the roadmap and have expressed some concern about whether a separate body of high-level individuals might actually take attention away from the IGF. There's a risk that a new body would not be accountable to the multi-stakeholder community. It might not have ownership and responsibility for strengthening the IGF. And its role would in some ways overlap with the role of the MAG, perhaps causing confusion or even conflict, as well as extra bureaucracy and extra cost. So I'm interested in the panel's views on whether they think any of those concerns have any merit, and if so, what might be done to try to mitigate them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think there, for this question, also some support from Wolfgang, which I assume is Wolfgang Klein. Looking at our speakers for today, is anyone among you who would like to take up this question? Yes, Bill, please go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Paul. Well, we've had these conversations in the context of the MAG working group we are both on, and we've had quite a lively debate about it. Obviously, there is a tension when you say high level. If people get into this idea that to have high level, that means you get like these big name potentates who have not been really engaged in the IGF, and they start to see themselves as a separate sort of power center or source of authority that speaks independently and so on, then that becomes problematic. And so I think what some of us have said, and again, you're fully immersed in all this conversation, is that perhaps what it ought to be is something attached to or a subset of the MAG or something like that, that would play a role more with regard to propagating outcomes, bringing attention to them, et cetera, rather than having some independent policy-making, advisory kind of role. Certainly one thing I think probably everybody would agree with, if there's going to be a high-level body, the high-level body does not get to speak for the IGF in a way that's independent of whatever the, quote, community has been doing. So the question is, how do you embed it within that framework and ensure that the actions that they undertake are of a liaison in public relations, communicating output kind of nature without presuming to become an independent decision-making source. And that's very hard, particularly if you have, quote, very senior people, because senior people, of course, are always going to feel like, if I'm here to do something, and I want it to be recognized that I did something. So telling, senior people to just be part of a shared process in a horizontal way with a lot of other people, that's a tough call. And that would just take a lot of clear communication at the front end in setting this up. But I'm interested in what your thoughts are on that point. Obviously, you've had expressed concerns about this, but let's hear from the others too.
Yes, so looking at the other panelists, perhaps first, any comments on this? Any thoughts in support or contrary? Yes, Olga, please.
Thank you, Paul, and hi, hello. As I said before, and I think Andrea pointed that out when he made his first intervention, I am afraid that this fragmentation is increasing, and this, in my humble opinion, would bring more fragmentation and perhaps some more confusion. So I think it will add more bureaucracy and confusion, but of course it depends on how it's implemented and all. I think Bill expressed that very well. Thank you.
On that note, I would also like to bring Professor Wolfgang Klein into the discussion. I think to this particular issue. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Olga is certainly right when she says, she fears that there will be more fragmentation. But if you look backwards, we had always two tendencies which conflicted each other. And so the challenge now for the, let's say, like-minded stakeholder groups is to do something to avoid that this goes in the direction. Probably tomorrow we will have even, tomorrow morning we will have even another shock that the fragmentation of the internet is further pushed forward, from a global political point of view, because we have now these two competing global initiatives. On the one hand, the Trump administration is fighting for a clean network and building a network fortress. And on the other hand, China has proposed a global secure data initiative. So that means the IGF could become sandwiched between this American-Chinese cyber conflict. And insofar, if you just watch this and remain passive, this is rather dangerous. And I think the roadmap gives us really a good opportunity, but it says also we have to act now and here, and we cannot wait another 5 years. So insofar, the basic ideas like the liaisons and some other ideas with the various panels, the parliamentarian track, the governmental track. So we have to have decisions within the next 6 months. I think this is really important. There is no time to wait anymore. And at the moment, it's still unclear who takes the decision. Will it be done by UNDESA? Will it be done by the Secretary General of the United Nations? Will we wait until we have the technology envoy and he is the internet czar for the world and makes the decision? Is it done by the MAC? I think I would encourage the MAC to move forward because they have a mandate and they should take decisions as much as they can. And so to do the next small steps, no big jumps, small steps are much sustainable than big jumps. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you for this comment. Speaking of acting here and now, we have 5 minutes left, which brings me back to my speakers and the humble request to them for a very final word, a final comment, perhaps responding to the last couple of comments and questions we heard, or giving a very final overview on the things we discussed today. Basically, we have 1 minute for each speaker. I would like to go in the same order as we started. So that means starting with Bill, your final word.
My final word, I guess, would be first, thank you for organizing this. Secondly, I think that the concerns about high-level bodies and other new bodies or sub-bodies that might be created goes back to the point I was making about engagement at the front end. None of these things will really be sustainable if we can't figure out how to bring people in more fully. In ICANN, you have a year-long range of activities by a highly institutionalized community. In the IGF, we've never had anything like that. And unless you have something that sort of draws people into a routinized, structured kind of process with RFCs and so on, then you're not going to be able to make any of these other things work effectively. And that includes the high level, but certainly the other parts that have been suggested by the panel and so on. So I think we have to figure out how to do more to make people feel there are stakes here and get engaged and stay engaged.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Olga, your final word, maybe not in total, but for this session.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And thanks, colleagues, for your comments. I think the IGF has to remain. It has to be reinforced, restructured. I think it's too broad. It has to have more focus. And I think this is a good opportunity to rethink about it. I think it is captured in its structure now, and that has to change. I spent 2 hours trying to figure out on which sessions I have to participate, and that's too much. It has to, I like Bill's comment, bringing people, and this process should be more inclusive and more active during the year, and it has to, of course, try to bring these voices from developing economies. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yes, Matthias, any final words from you?
Yeah, I still firmly believe that we need to share more of the knowledge basis on which policy making is conducted. If we do that and we talk to a broader group of stakeholders, we can very much increase the legitimacy of any solution to which we will arrive. This focus on process, I think, is an overlooked potential. And if you just look through all the fantastic submissions that the recommendation process received, which were available online, and you can see that how many great ideas are out there. And I do firmly believe that at some point the great ideas will be realized. Thank you very much for organizing this and having me.
Oh, thank you. And then last but not least, Andrea, your final words, reflections for today.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly emerged that fragmentation is something that concerns a lot of us here in the room today. And I mean, fragmentation from a geopolitical perspective, again, we need to be sure that cyber capacity building is something that, although it was already announced in 2003-5, still there is a lot of work to do there. And but also we discussed about the issue, fragmentation around the issues. So, and the need to ensure that communities will talk with each other. And the IGF is clearly the platform that we usually support, because each of us attend IGF, whether it happens in Bali or online. We are always here talking with each other, which is great. And but of course, it's clear that the IGF lacks a credibility. So, and it's clearly the moment to push for this reform that is called for years now. So whether the reform might the establishment of a high-level group might be a solution, I personally don't see any problem in doing that, because it's clearly that we need some, I mean, my impression is every time we do a high-level group, there is some efficiency around that. The problem is not the existence of a high-level group, the problem is to be sure that there are clear lines of representations of this community that IGF needs to represent in order to overcome the fragmentation, the risk of fragmentation that we are discussing here today. So as soon as this will be possible, then I'm going to be optimistic about future scenarios on the IGF in general.
Thank you so much. All that's left for me to do is thank our speakers for today. It has been an absolute pleasure to also thank the participants for your comments and your questions. It was an extremely lively, sometimes also controversial debate, which was fantastic to see. For me personally, it was a pleasure to bring debates on internet governance into this space of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training, where we have these debates once a month on issues in diplomatic practice, and to kind of spend one session to focus on internet governance while the IGF is also getting underway was quite important for me, and was a pleasure to kind of combine these two communities that I'm operating in usually. As always, we will follow up with the summary and the recording from the session, and I will have the challenging task to attempt to summarize the discussion today, which will give me some sleepless nights, I think. Last but not least, at DiploFoundation and the IGF, we will be reporting from the IGF sessions, and you can follow us there, and you can give us comments and feedbacks on what we're doing in this context. Last but not least, let me thank everyone again for the participation and for a very engaging, very interesting debate today. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Catherine and Diplo.
Thank you, Katerina.
Stay safe.
Take
Bye.
care.